Hey everyone, I'm Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 5 demo for the piece I call Brooke, Rookery Punk. Now, before we get into this, I know it's been a while since I've been putting out videos. I said I was going to take a little bit of a break, and it ended up being quite a break. Work has just been super busy, life has been super busy, everything is going on all the time. So I just want to let you know that I do plan on coming back and doing some more videos, this being one of them. I just need to make sure that I'm carving out the right amount of time, that's all. Also, the Q&A video that I asked everybody for some questions for, that is still being made. I just haven't had time to sit down and set up a camera. So that is on my priority list. I hope to get that done very soon. So if you still have questions for that, jump on over there and leave it. If you've already left a question there, I promise I'll get to it. All right, let's get into talking about Brooke. So here's Brooke, a new joiner to my monster character design series, where I'm taking sort of like classic monsters, or at least different monster types, and trying to sort of do like a new character with a new spin on them. If you've not seen those in the past, just go through my channel. There's a bunch of them. They're all sort of colored with a similar theming and structure, so you should be able to spot them pretty easily. Now, a lot of you in the past have asked if I could sort of talk about how I structure my anatomy, and while I would say that I don't go into crazy detail here, I do kind of talk about like how I'm shape driven and how I go for forms over specific anatomy, and then eventually add the anatomy in later. And I also talk about some of the things that I prioritize, like structure and center of balance and all that. So hopefully the next chunk of video that you're going to see is going to be something that you've been looking forward to. If you have more questions on this subject though, feel free to hit me up in the comments below. And then after we go through this next section, I'm going to do a normal walkthrough of the whole video. So I hope you enjoy it, and let's get going. So this here would be Brooke's basic anatomy. Now I don't always do an anatomical breakdown, but when I'm trying to figure out the anatomy of something that I've never really addressed before, which would in this case be a gargoyle, and then I don't know what the costume is going to be yet, but I know I want to do a gargoyle, this is usually where I start. Then we throw on some costumes. In this case, since this whole series is sort of influenced by 80s and synthwave, we go with this sort of new wave punker look. And for this particular piece, since we didn't exactly know where we wanted to go with it, we do just some quick color keys to see if we can sort out the direction for her flats. But that'll all be part of the costuming. How do we actually get to this anatomical structure? Well, when you watch the full time lapse and I talk through it, you're going to see it fly through kind of like this. Maybe it'll be a little bit slower, but you'll see just all these little scribbles go down. You'll kind of see the anatomy take shape, and it'll just look like it just kind of happens. That's because a lot of the work being done at this stage is just in my head. But what do I mean by that? Well, when I'm drawing a character, I'm not really thinking about anatomy. I am thinking, of course, about things like deltoids and biceps and pecs and rib cages and all that kind of stuff, but I'm really actually thinking more about shapes and groups of shapes and how I can communicate the dimensionality of that. So when you see here, and I'm sketching this character, you can see I do like some really loose stuff, but it's all about sort of getting something onto the page that's an anchor point for me to then attach something else to it. When this little sketch here started, there was just a circle. Sometimes literally any mark on the page is a way to get started and start building off of it, and just sort of practicing what those marks are might actually accelerate that process. So when you see here, it's a circle, line, I've already got kind of like the front of the face. Then I start kind of sketching out a shape that's more my own, which is the shape that goes around like the cheek, chin, jaw, up to ear kind of thing. Then I do like the back of the cranium, and then I start working my way down the body. And what I'm trying to do every time here is I'm trying to essentially isolate a chunk of the body. I actually think of it very much in the way that you might see like a 3D block out. Not saying that it's a precise 3D thing, but I'm thinking of it more about these big blocks of shapes. Now, you've seen a lot of methodologies like that from different people and different resources, right? I largely learned how to draw just kind of on my own, like a lot of people do, but a book that was like really important to me when I was a kid, and a lot of people, especially my age, is How to Draw the Marvel Way. And so I picked up some like tricks from there, but then as time went on, like I was like a lot of people my age, I'd get Wizard magazine magazine, and I would read like Crash Course or something like that, and I would like pick up some like little tips here and there. So the way that I learned to draw initially was a lot of sort of like feel and blocks of shapes. What I'm hoping to accomplish at the stage like this is something that I feel is a form in which I can then layer costuming on. So of course, this character, we do a little bit of an anatomical breakdown before we start getting the costume on. And if you were drawing somebody like a superhero, you'd have to do a lot of anatomy. But for this, it's really about where am I going to go with this in the future. At some point, I do say, well, I'm going to get a little bit more anatomical and it's going to be less shape driven. But my real point here is to just try and capture the gist of what I'm going for as if she were a mannequin that we were eventually going to dress up. You'll also see here, because of course we live in a digital world, made a couple of decisions that I didn't like, and so I'm going in here and cutting it up and shifting her head around and getting her posture where I want her to be. And this is really the kind of thing that would then drive the rest of the illustration. So that's just a little bit of live drawing to kind of show you where my head's at, but like, how do we go from something like this into something more like this? Well, first let's talk about the things that I find important and the sort of principles that I'm trying to drive when I do character design like this. First, I want to center everything around a center of gravity. This allows the character to feel stable because stability is pretty important unless you're actually going for a character that's deliberately unstable. I think something that an error maybe that people make sometimes when they're doing their character designs is their character might not feel solid and they can't really figure out why, and it's because maybe the character is actually tilting and they don't realize it, or they've structured the body or the anatomy in a way that doesn't feel like it's actually supporting the forms. We can also do this through establishing some weight, so let's move into that. Now her feet go off the page, which would also have some mass, but these are the three areas that I consider to be kind of her biggest masses. Yes, she has her arms there, but the arms you can do a lot of things, but this is more about the posture and how her general stance is going to be. I also focus on rhythm. You can see here, especially down in her legs, we have a lot of rhythm moving through her legs in order to try and make those feel natural. They also feel stronger this way, and they feel elegant, but like they are structural to her standing correctly. So even though she has these big wings and this tail, which are technically part of her sort of like secondary or tertiary masses or rules that I'm trying to follow, this is kind of the structure of her. But then again, there's also a lot more flow if you really look at it as well. We're trying to catch the rhythm any chance we can. Here's another shot of her. We'll switch it to pink. I think it might be a little bit easier to see. So what you end up having here is some rhythm in the legs that are really pushing down in these sort of curved motions that's really anchoring the character down to the ground. And then you've got this other sort of like secondary and tertiary movement in things like her head and hair and the sloping of her shoulders and all that kind of stuff. With this character, the macro motion that we're trying to capture here is kind of like a big tree. You could really think about this, since she's a gargoyle, think about it in terms of the show gargoyles when, like, you know, Goliath would like puff himself up and spread his wings. He's got this strong base that comes up and then kind of like flows out into this really big shape at the top, and that's what we're going for with this character as well. But this is all now layered on top of the actual structure. And so what you can see here is this sort of mannequin-esque breakdown of the way I think about the underlying structure of this character. We have these like balls almost for her shoulders. We have that rib cage shape for her rib cage. Then we've got these big meaty legs because of the proportions of this character. She's very bottom heavy because she's a gargoyle, and that's kind of the way they're usually depicted. I like them having big, powerful legs. And then you have all these other masses that I'm trying to capture here to kind of show just how I think about it, as if it were a like wooden maquette. Now these are the parts that an artist usually keeps all in their head. You don't necessarily have to put all of this down on the paper. You might resort to putting this all down on the paper when you're trying to figure out something that's really complicated. But if you're somebody who is, in this case, let's say a character designer drawing a character who's just standing there, maybe a lot of this can be left off the page. It's similar to when you were in school and you would just kind of know the answer to a math question because you would quickly do it in your head and you would know, but the teacher would always say, show your work. This is the equivalent of showing my work here. If I were just sitting here and doing this, I would leave out a bunch of this, which is what you see when you actually see the time lapse here in a minute. So all of this kind of stuff is running in my head while I'm doing it, but I shouldn't say running in my head like it's some big magic trick. It's really more just like I've drawn shoulders a million times, I've drawn arms a million times, all these different things. So I kind of know where they're supposed to go, and I can kind of plot that out in my head. I'm actually doing some of these solves in real time. I'm just not necessarily putting it down on paper. But if I were to run into something that was really, I just didn't know what to do there, then I would have to actually do some layered sketching and try to solve it for real. Now this I would largely call, it is technically anatomy, but it's more like proportion and like these groupings of parts of the body. Again, I know that's technically anatomy, but anatomy I usually think of as like, am I putting all the muscles in the right spots and the bones and all that kind of stuff? All the parts that protrude through the skin and define that shape, am I putting them all in the right places? And I don't even put them all in the right places all the time. Sometimes I screw that up. That's just the way it goes. Here you can see now we've layered on some more detailing that's actually more about the musculature and the actual anatomical definitions of the character. And if she weren't in this hunched position, her shoulders would be more back like this. This would be her kind of like standing at attention with her arms straight down. And obviously she doesn't have normal human proportions. Her arms are super long and her hands are particularly big in the final illustration. Now let's get her finished up a little bit more here, get her feet into the screen since we don't have that in the original illustration. You can see right here, this is kind of weird because we're talking about a character that has that raised heel, but we are still trying to establish the same thing, which is a planted foot that actually establishes them in a 3D space. Even though this character is raised up on the balls of her feet, we're still maintaining where her center of gravity is, and we're still giving her that splayed stance, so that in an actual 3D space, she feels like she's super stable. You could communicate this character still being pretty stable if her feet were right together, but we're trying to actually make sure that we've got the type of stance that makes it look like you can't really push her over. She's just solid and standing there. It's actually funny, a solid stance means a lot for understanding the physicality of a character and how solid they are. You can see here that we maintain her center of gravity, and then we have this triangle that's kind of formed between her feet and that center of gravity to make it feel like she is absolutely stable standing there in that position. So why do we put in all this work on the mannequin part? So that we can then throw whatever costuming we want on the character. This is a really good way, especially if you happen to have a character who's going to be wearing a lot of different clothes for these monster series. I mean, I'm basically just doing one-offs, but here I am just kind of throwing some different clothes on this character. Oh, I forgot her horns, by the way, when we get to the horn part, but anyways, she's just got like her headband and her hair pulled back. But the idea is that now you can play with this and you've got this really solid base to always be working with. I usually deal with expressive anatomy. I'm not really going for like hyper accurate. I just kind of want to get those shapes and the emotion and like what I'm trying to, the type of character I'm trying to convey in there. But from this point on now, you can actually go and plug in all the anatomy. You can get all those little details in like that you see right here, where you've got like some obliques and then you've got like more muscle definition. You've just established more of her anatomy in order to make her feel like she's a real person. Now, depending on your stylization, you'll either go way further with the anatomy or you'll actually pull back and you'll go to more things that are shape driven and you'll stay at that shape driven stage. But for this illustration and generally my style, I then went in and added a couple of extra details. So we went down a step, right? And then here she is with her clothing layered on, and that's what you'll be seeing now in the rest of this demo. So now we'll discuss the front to back completion of Brooke. Now, if you have been on this channel before, this time I'm going to treat this like I've never described this before. If this is your first time on the channel, I'm going to describe the whole process of this as thoroughly as I can. We're going to leave the speed be about this because it feels pretty good. And if you want to get even more details on this methodology, go back through some of the other monster videos and you're going to see like all of them and all the detail. So with all of these monster character designs, there's essentially two things that I try to do every time. One, pick a monster type that already exists that I could have fun with. In this case, a gargoyle, which isn't a classic universal monsters type thing, but it certainly is a type of monster we're all familiar with. And then the other part is, can I do something unique with it, especially through the lens of that kind of like 80s motif that all of these characters have. They're synthwave inspired, they're 80s inspired, the real neon side of 80s, not the more pastel side of 80s. And so that's kind of like the entire spirit of the sort of creative process behind every one of these characters. So with this one, I thought, let's go with the whole new wave vibe. I actually didn't have a character that really like hit that perfectly. So she's like new wave, punk, that sort of overlap where those two genres kind of rubbed up against each other. And the idea, the other thing, once I kind of like got into it, you can see coming out right here in the flats process is, can I do a character whose skin is very, very dull, because all of the other characters are usually really, really bright, but have everything else about her be super saturated and bright. And of course, the reason why I wanted to do this is because, being a gargoyle, I was trying to decide whether or not I wanted her to be brightly colored or like stone colored, like she's actually made of stone, or at the very least has like such a thick, dense, rough skin that it's like she's stone come to life. And so that's why she's got this like super, super dull gray skin, which I do eventually pull a little bit more color into, but it's still not like the other characters. We've got characters in this lineup that are bright yellow, bright green, bright everything. This character is just gray. And so can I do the big bright hair? Can I do the other colorful clothing? Now, one thing I want to mention here is I, like just about any decent human being, am a huge fan of gargoyles. And I wanted to see if I could, do some of the things that gargoyles had like set out as this is what gargoyles are, but then bring in some new things that just weren't quite like that Disney version. So there's going to be some aspects of this that feel familiar in that way and others that don't. I pulled inspiration from a lot of different depictions of gargoyles ultimately, but I can't help but be influenced by gargoyles most of the time anyway, so of course I was going to have to pump some of that into here, which, by the way, if you're a fan of gargoyles, there's a little, just very small surprise at the end of this video. Now that we got all the idea stuff out of the way, let's start talking about the process. I have a brush pack that is linked down below. It's a free download. It just goes to like a Google Drive link. If you want to use the exact brushes that I'm using here, that's how you do it. In that brush pack, there's one that's called like New Turpentine or something like that. That's because I enjoyed the turpentine brush that was in Procreate, but I wanted to make my own version of it, and that's what's here. And then the rest of them are actually kind of replications of other things that I liked in Procreate, but I had tweaked. And so instead I decided to make a lot of those tweaks just brand new brushes. And so you'll see like the pencil that I sketched with, you'll see the solid round that I used for some things. Although this piece that you're seeing here was entirely done, well, it was drawn with the fat pencil, and then it was painted, every part of it, with that new turpentine brush. And the smudging that you'll see me do is also with that brush being set to the new turpentine brush. So the phase that I'm at right now in this illustration is the flatting phase. This is basically where I'm just going through and I'm blocking out where all of the big solid chunks are, but there's no shading going on. In fact, the only thing here that you could potentially call shading, although it's not, but I mean it's something other than a pure flat, is we've got a gradient green on that orange hair, and then we've got some skin variation also on the skin, although that's turned off right now, but you'll see it pop back on again in a minute. Sometimes when I'm working in Photoshop, but especially when I'm working in Procreate, I use a method that I call Select Paint, Select Clear. That's linked down below if you want to follow that and see the details. But essentially what that is every one of these flats are on their own layer. I put all those layers into a big folder, and then on top of that there's a series of folders that have things like shadows. I use multiply layers in order to get my shadows, and I use a variety of other layers, layer types, different blend modes to do the highlight side of things. The type of shadow that we're going to be using for this piece, because it's the same shadow that we use for all of the other pieces in the series, is like a light pale purple, slightly on the red side, but it's a purple nonetheless. I want to reference all that crazy stuff you just saw happening on the screen a second ago. Sometimes in order to solidify that I know where I'm going with the whole thing, and sometimes to preserve some steps for these types of videos, I will kind of like prepare the image just to save something out so that it's clear and it's not too messy. That's what all that noise was, but a lot of those layers then got deleted because I'll just reconstruct them in a better way going forward, things like the rim light. So the way I'm doing the shadows right now is I am essentially doing an AO pass, or an ambient occlusion pass. It's not quite that. I usually refer to my method as like a form shadow pass, which none of these are like legit terms, so just do your best to follow along. But essentially what I'm trying to do with that pass is establish the topology of the different parts of this character, and some of those things are going to be really strictly following the rules of something like an ambient occlusion and a shadow, and others will just kind of be like, this feels right now. Nothing I do, similar to what I was describing with the anatomy, I don't do everything just to make it be like correct, quote unquote, although correct is a moving target, and that's kind of the point I'm about to make, is there's times where maybe the lighting that I'm doing isn't 100% the way that it would be, but I'm doing it because it'll either make the image clearer, or it will, I don't know, maybe it's something where I'm trying to express something with it. I don't know, it depends. But the point is that it's following like a core set of rules until those rules aren't serving me anymore, and then we make an adjustment. We try to make it do what we need it to do. So what I'm doing here with these shadows is that select paint, select clear method that I mentioned before. I'm selecting the flats layer. So I'm tapping on the layer, tapping it again so that I can then hit the select contents or select button. And what that'll do is it'll actually create a selection of the shape of the flat thing that I'm working with. Then I go back up to my shadow layer and I start painting into my shadows, and it's nice and it's like frisket. Like if you ever did like airbrushing or whatever, it's so I can be nice and free, but I've got this nice mask around it so that I can be a little wild and it doesn't go outside of it. But then, because I'm on a shadow layer that's on top of all the flats, I will use the next flat up when I get to it to select it, and then I'll clear it from the shadow. That way I'm sort of clearing away all the noise that got created on top of that, and then I'll reselect it and then start painting on that shadow layer. And then I just kind of repeat that process over and over and over and over again, all the way until I'm done with that particular phase of shadow, and then I'll move to the next phase of shadow or the next highlight or whatever it is. I think that this would be a lot clearer if you went back and looked at that select paint, select clear video, if you haven't seen that before or haven't seen this method before. So there's a bunch of stuff here that's also, I should reference, it's like surface detail that the lighting isn't really going to matter for. So for instance, you can see that her fishnets are off right now, as well as her skin tone variations are off, and at some point too I'll turn off that gradient in her hair, and that's just to reduce the amount of noise that I'm looking at, so that I can essentially well, it's shadows, but I'm applying lighting, so I can shadow without being distracted about like all these different color variations. And then when I turn those back on again, because the shadow layer is reactive because it's set to multiply, I'll get those colors back. So you can see right there, I turned on the darker part of her leggings, I've turned on the color variation on like her tail and her wings, as well as the sort of thinner webby part of her wings. And so now we've got that nice transition where the color is passing through the shadow that's already applied. For those who don't know, multiply is effectively a layer that anything closer to white is transparent, anything closer to black is solid. So if you're just using a scale of, white to gray to black, you're going to get different levels of that opacity. However, if you slide over into more of the color section where you're dealing with like saturation and other things, some of that color also pulls through. So in order to get a nice reactive shadow here, we're using like a light pale purple that will make it darker because of the nature of multiply, but because it has color properties, it'll also bring some of that color in, and you get an intermingling of those two colors. Now, what we're doing here is the cast shadow. So this cast shadow is now on a separate shadow layer, because the idea is that all of the stuff that we did with the ambient occlusion form shadow layer, we still want that information there, and we're layering shadow upon shadow now, so that when you are within that cast shadow, you still have dimension and form, and then when you're outside of it, you do as well, but now one is in shadow and one is not in shadow. Speaking of times where I don't follow the rules, you can see there's a shadow here I'm painting of her horn casting a shadow down on her head. That is the way that would be cast. And theoretically, I could also now make those eyes glow, and it might look kind of cool under there. But since this is a character, I should say, since this is a character design, this is presenting the character, I don't want that face to entirely be obscure. Now, if it was a cool character like Nightcrawler, who's like always got the dark around the eyes and the glowing sticking out, all that stuff, maybe that's a look for her, but that's just not the look that I was intending. So I broke those shadow rules on that particular part so that I could get those shadows off of her eyes. And I don't think many people really realize that. I don't think it's something where people are like, why isn't that casting properly? I think it's just I think it just works. Now we're on to the rounding shadows. This is, I should say this is an area where I use a different brush. I use a big soft brush. I think I call it like Big Softy or something like that in my brush set. It's basically just a big fat airbrush. And the idea is I add some additional support shadows like on the distant side of the character from where the light is coming from, just to soften and turn that form a little. If I'm going for a more painterly thing, I'll make it more rough, but with these they're painterly but with more polish in there. And so I think it kind of helps to soften it a little bit. Now we're going in and applying the light. In this case, I'm not using any special blend modes. All I'm doing is taking the layer and reducing the opacity a lot. We're using a really bright aqua almost. That is the color of the lighting for the monster series, and so I'm using it again because I'm trying to keep these all lit very consistently. So I think it's down to like, I don't know, maybe even like 10% opacity, because I want the light to sit on top of the skin as opposed to picking up the colors like too much and making it more intense. There are times where, depending on the style that I'm going for, I might set the lighting to like an overlay or a soft light or something, and there may even be little soft light or overlay touches here or there where I put like a glint somewhere or something like that, but the majority of the lighting in this is done with a normal layer. You'll also notice that as a supporting layer, I put in a new shadow layer. It's really hard to see kind of at first, but it's these cracks. I wanted to kind of make it look like she's living stone. So maybe when you touch her, she's like maybe got some, like you could press her shoulder in just like a little bit, but it would still feel rough and kind of like it was forcing back on you. And it would have cracks in it too. So, you know, just something that's kind of like this weird organic stone type thing. All of the pieces for the Monster Design series also have a rim light in the bottom, that's like the color of the fog that's around them, as well as a light coming down from slightly behind them, and then it's creating like an orange light on their shoulders. That's because the very first character in the series, Larry, was sort of created like a classic undead, sort of like Frankenstein adjacent character, and I thought it would be cool to light him that way, and then I just ended up making it the way they're all lit. So I have a couple more characters in the series actually on deck to be painted, and one of them has some interesting properties. So having the light pass through, what does that mean? It's going to be really fun to do. So here, I'm just painting this rim light in with white. I already kind of know where I'm going to have that light come from behind her. It's not there yet, but it'll be in there. And then what I do is I usually colorize this white with a little bit of an orangey yellow. And that'll be done by selecting the rim light once I'm done with it, creating a new layer and filling that in with that orangey light. And then I'll duplicate that again and I'll blur it. And then with that sort of like blurred orange and then that solid orange rim light over the white rim light, I can adjust all the various opacities to get kind of the perfect color that I'm looking for, which is like a whitish orangish light where the bloom off of it is more orange. You can also see in the sort of web part of her wings, we're trying to get a little subsurface scattering going on here, and that's just by kind of hand painting it in, just picking an orange, painting it in, and then lowering that opacity until it feels right. And you can see there I'm toggling everything, just kind of seeing how it all comes together. And we've got ourselves a finished Brooke. Right there. And now we have a very disinterested teen new wave gargoyle punker type person. So again, these characters are so much fun to do. I try not to do too many of them now. I did a big run of them and I'd like to not kill it, but I got a couple more ideas, so I'm going to do a couple more. I hope you enjoyed looking at the process here. Let's go through all the major stages. Here we've got the super rough at the very beginning, just to know like, yeah, sure, something like that feels right. Then some refinements where we've got her basic anatomy and we know the general direction of her character. Here we have the rough block in, the color keys for where we're going to go, which we do change a little bit as time goes on. Then we've got the flats. This is when the flats were done before I started actually painting. And then here is the final painting again. And just to show respect, here is a Demona variant of Brooke, because I just thought that would be really fun to do. And so here's one last close-up. So I hope you enjoyed watching this. Hopefully I can get to some more videos again real soon. If you did enjoy this, please consider hitting like and hitting subscribe and hitting the bell and all that stuff. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.